Okay, so if you're like me, when Christmas comes around, maybe not like me so much, but when Christmas comes around, I'm always thinking about what I know about Christmas. And every year I think I know everything I need to know about Christmas, right? I mean, it's very simple. I've watched, Charlie Brown Christmas. I watch Linus go up on the stage and read Luke for us. I mean, I know what's going on. And so every year, and it happened this year too, I go to God and I say, there really isn't much new to talk about when it comes to Christmas. And in a sense, that's kind of true. In another sense, that's really not true, because the actual event is so, what do you want to call it? So unusual, see, I'm at a loss for words. It is such a particularly peculiar event in the entire timeline of history. You can sit there and look at the same facts for the rest of your life and still say, this is incredible. And you can miss some of the subtleties of it. So this year I prayed and said, God, what am I missing? And that's what we're going to look at for the next 3 weeks. So they're just things that God, for me at least, he says, okay, Jim, you think you know it all, but I think you're missing pieces, and here's pieces that you're missing. So we're going to spend the next 3 weeks, from my personal perspective, about things that I've been missing all these years. And we're also going to cover things that we may know, but we may not know fully. So that's where we're going. So I just said, God, show me the unexpected things that I didn't ever see. And so that's what this is. So here we go, the unexpected Savior. So what we're going to do this morning is look at Isaiah 9. And everybody knows Isaiah 9. In fact, when we do Peach Days, take someone who's volunteering and spin them around, and you're going to read it on the back of their T-shirts. That's what we do with Isaiah 9. So it's very well known, but it is a great example of where we read it every year and go, well, that is pretty cool, and then go off and buy Christmas presents. So I just want to slow down and look at this really. So that's just really basically all we're going to look at is Isaiah 9 this morning, and see what we've missed. So we see this, it starts out, for unto us a child is born, a son is given, and then astonishingly, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. Right, that's what Jesus is indeed that person who's in charge of everything. But when I read this phrase, it's a very funny phrase, government. This word government doesn't show up in the rest of the Old Testament. But in fact, the Hebrew word shows up only in 2 places in the entire Old Testament. Verse 6, and then in verse 7 of Isaiah 9. So that's usually a clue to you to say, okay, well, what's peculiar about this? Well, this is what's peculiar about this. This word in Hebrew means rule and dominion. Now, that's not really so unusual, but it doesn't say king. It says rule and dominion in such a general sense that you can actually put a word in front of it and say the rule and the dominion. Well, the rule and the dominion of what? Everything. That's why this word is a stunner. I never had seen this before. All through the rest of the Old Testament, you'll see lots of discussion about a king and his sovereignty and what he does. And Jesus is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. We get that. But this is the idea of King of Kings and Lord of Lords packed into a single stunning word. Read it. And basically, the rule shall be upon his shoulder. The dominion. Everything. It doesn't presume any limited sense of contact. It's everything. Everything. I mean, everything. So when you read this verse, even when you're in the middle of Isaiah 9, and you know the history that Isaiah is talking into in the nation of Israel, you would hope that Isaiah would speak about God providing some kind of ruler who would fix the problems that Israel's in the midst of Isaiah. And after all, Isaiah is a prophet to the nation of Israel, and the nation of Israel is not doing well. They need to be turned around. But when he gets to this, instead of saying that this one's going to be born and that he'll be a ruler or he'll be a king or he'll take care of the problems here, instead it takes this word and broadens out. So now we understand we're not just talking about someone who's in charge of Israel. We're talking about someone who has all rule. And that's what that one word means. It's so stunning, it's not used anywhere else except Isaiah 9, 6, and 7. So this is your first clue when you come into this set of verses, that we're not talking about just a man-made context. It's not just the nation of Israel and the captivity and the waywardness they had. There's something big happening right here. And the government, the rule. So government really is a bad translation because governments change based on countries. And that's not what he's saying. He's saying all dominion is his. All rule is his. Wow. And they'll be upon his shoulder. It'll be his responsibility to rule. Okay. In Matthew 28, it reminded me of this. At the end of Matthew's gospel, the resurrected Jesus is with the disciples, and Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. So go therefore and make disciples of all nations. So not just Israel. I mean, Jesus says this at the end of his ministry there physically. He says, all authority has been given to me. That's exactly a perfect interpretation of that word in Isaiah 9:6. Everything. All authority. And it's interesting that Jesus would say this to the apostles before they go out and spread the message, because they're not just going to go to Israel. So if Jesus says, okay, guys, you need to go to Turkey, and you need to go to Italy, and you need to go, and by the way, all authority in Israel has been given to me. Not quite enough. What you'd like to know is that all authority has been given to him everywhere you go. He's the King of kings and Lords of lords, even in Italy and even in Turkey, and everywhere you're going to go soon, I'm in charge of those places as well. So, see, it's really a broadened idea of all that stuff. So this government will be on his shoulder, this rule and authority, and his name shall be called, and we know this list coming up in a second, but I want to stop at name, because we forget about the fact that name, you know, we all have one name, all of us, I think, well, and a middle name, and maybe a middle name, and then you have your friends who call you things, and then you have your mom that calls you something else when she's mad, you know. So technically we think of ourselves as having one name. Technically, that's what's on your driver's license, but we don't really have one name. And what he's going to introduce to us in a second here is the fact that this one who has all rule and dominion also doesn't really have a single name. He can have many names that apply to what he does. And that's because name in an ancient sense, we say this all the time, name in an ancient sense is really more of your reputation rather than just an arbitrary name, right? So instead of just calling someone Bob, there he is. Instead of just calling, which means nothing, but if you call, that sounds bad, doesn't it? He's actually, what does Bob mean? I don't really know. Oh, that's the bobbing up and down. That's sort of. Wow, that's even worse. We're going to let that go now. Oh, just saying, BJ. So anyway, the name in ancient times was given to you once you demonstrated a certain trait, right? And we see for us in this part of the world, it's our nearest kind of connection to that is Native Americans. They would name folks based, their kids based on what they were good at. So when someone told someone else that didn't know you what your name was, it was really an introduction to the kind of person that you were based on what the name was. See, so it was a reflection of who you were more than anything else. So that's what we're talking about here. So name right here, always think reputation, a reputation based upon actions. So anytime in the Old Testament you see his name was, say his reputation was, and his reputation is his name, okay? So that's what we're talking about. So what are the various traits we're talking about? Well, the first one is wonderful counselor. Now, if you haven't thought about this before, that is a very unusual first trait of someone who has all rule and dominion. Don't you think? That is very odd, because you would think if you're talking about all rule and all dominion, this is someone who has authority and a reach to everything that exists in the universe. Why would I ever expect someone at that high a power and that wide a reach to care one whit about me that he could give me counseling that would be marvelous? Why would that ever be part of that? You think about old kingdoms, go back to King David in Israel, who was sort of the pinnacle of the kings, even though he was really a messed up guy. I mean, he had people killed, and he was a messed up guy, but he was a man after God's own heart. Not that God endorsed his murders, but because there was something about him that was always bent toward God, even though his flesh sinned. So here's David. Now think about David. If you were in David's kingdom in Israel, it'd be a marvelous thing to be able to have him as your king, because he had a reputation before he was the king. Saul had his 10,000s and David his 100,000s and 10,000s. He was very accomplished in the military field. There's a lot about David you loved about the fact that he was your king. But the fact that you could actually go to the king's place where he lives and knock on the door and say, oh, yeah, I'm just here to see if David wants to go out for some coffee so we can sit and chat and he can give me some advice. Not going to happen, because he's in charge of everything in Israel. So here we have someone whose rule and dominion is limitless, and that's everything is under this person's control. Why would you ever expect and ever put in your trait list of this person that he's a wonderful counselor? That I don't know if you ever thought about it, but that by itself is very unexpected in this list. It does not make any sense. So that tells us that this one on whose shoulders is all rule and dominion is accessible enough to give you critical advice in your life. Is that physically, humanly possible? Well, no. It starts to open up the idea that we're not just talking about some human king. Not because it would be impossible. I always, as a kid, as I think about God and think about people praying, I've told you this before, but I come back to this all the time. As a kid, I would think, how is it possible for God to take all these phone calls at the same time? You know, I saw God in heaven, and I saw this gigantic switchboard, you know, that you saw from the 30s and 40s, the ladies, you know, putting plugs in and out of the board and stuff. I said, there must be like 1 billion people at the switchboard trying to get all these billion phone calls coming up from earth as people prayed and then hooked into God. And then God's kind of going, thanks, thanks, okay. And all he's doing all day is just doing this telephone call thing. I was thinking, that's like impossible. We're talking billions of people. This is impossible. Well, at a human level, it is impossible. But not at a divine level, it's not. So this is already telling us that we're looking at somebody who has all rule and all dominion, not limited by nations or nation boundaries, and someone who is accessible in ways that we cannot say is human. And yet, what he says to us is wonderful, and it's good counseling. That's incredible. Today, we have politicians. A collective groan goes there. We have politicians, and there's no way in which I would take a politician and give him the name that he's a wonderful counselor. That's not on top of my list. I don't know, maybe it's yours, but it's not the top of my list. Not only that, even if they're a very principled person, even still, the ability to have contact with one of these politicians who's principled and honorable, does good things, he's out for your benefit, all that kind of stuff, even still, they're isolated being in Washington, D.C., And even then, they may really only be skilled at politics, which, if you'll excuse me, is really about self-promotion, largely, these days. So why would I ever figure that even if I got an ear with this person who is masterful at self-promotion, that he would give me any advice that'd be worth it while at all to me? I mean, those ideas are so antithetical, so antithetical. So here we have wonderful counselors. I'll summarize on the right here. This wonderful counselor gives wise advice for your good, So not only is this being in charge of everything, this being knows your life and gives you counsel that's wonderful. Now, I can't think of the last time a human person gave me advice and I took 2 steps back and said, wow, that's wonderful. Now, maybe you have. I'm thinking, because what it takes is an intimate knowledge of you. It takes an intimate knowledge of what you're struggling with, what the challenges are in front of you. How can someone give me so good advice from the outside of my life that even me in the inside of my life, I would contrast them and go, wow, now that's incredible advice. That's wonderful. But this ruler does this. That's unexpected. And there's another unexpected phrase. Mighty God. What mighty God? Are you kidding me? Okay, so we already knew that this person who has limitless rule and dominion can't be just a human. Maybe this really is God himself. I mean, that would make most sense because he seems to be bigger than everything, and there's only one person who's bigger than everything, and that's God himself. So that makes sense. I go for that. It's not that surprising. But the phrase here is really kind of surprising because when I see this mighty God, every time I see God in the Old Testament, I love to look up and say, well, is this, which word for God is this? Is this Jehovah? Which one is this? Well, this is actually the tiniest one. It's the word El, which is a shorthand version of saying God. It's actually not always applied just to God. Many times it can be applied to people who are just mighty and in charge of things. You call them an El. So El always, always, always has at its core the idea of might and power. El always does. El always does. So if you want to raise a daughter who you want to raise up to be like Wonder Woman, name her El, because it's all about power and might, okay? El means power and might. And the word before God here means power and might. So he's actually crammed two gigantically powerful words together. And he says that this person is actually mighty strong, or mighty might, or a mighty, 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 or a mighty, Mr. Mighty who's mighty, mighty, mighty. I mean, the redundancy is supposed to sort of knock you off your chair when you see it in Hebrew, and we miss it because it just says mighty God. Well, of course God is mighty, but El means might. So this is the mighty might. This is the mighty strong one. Now, that's not really unusual. It's not unexpected if we're talking about God who has rule and dominion that's bigger than the whole universe. That makes sense. You know, I can see that. He's definitely not weak, you know, Mr. Weak God. It's not that. But why emphasize right here might? And in a doubly redundant way so as to kind of knock you back and say, this guy has everything. Mighty, mighty, strong, mighty, strong, mighty. Why is that important in this context? Well, because it means he's in control. There's nothing that's more in control than him. This one who rules and has dominion over everything, there's nothing that's mightier than him. By the way, his name is might, and we add the adjective mighty in front of it. Mighty might. That's what he is. Mighty strong, that's what he is. So in that sense, if he knows you well enough to give you wonderful counsel and wonderful advice in life because he's that interested in you and he's that intimate with you and he wants to see the best for you, isn't it wonderfully good news that the one who knows you that well also has the might of all the universe in order to affect what he wants for good in your life? Mighty, mighty strong. Whoa. We say this all the time. The theme comes up a lot when you look at themes in the Old or New Testament about people struggling in the sense of where they are. Maybe it's physical or economic or life and death. I mean, there's serious, serious problems in life. And what we have to come back to all the time, and I have to remind people, I have to remind myself of this, is that, wait a second, I'm still included in his rule and domain, right? Right. So he's really still in charge, right? And he knows me well and he loves me, right? Is he capable of enforcing good into my life? Yes, because he's Mr. Mighty Might. He can. So there's really no question about his ability, and that's what he's saying right here. So this one on whose shoulders all rule and dominion has been given, he's in charge of everything, is also the one that knows you well enough to give you the wisest counsel for your best. And he's also the one in his might that can make everything happen for your benefit. This is wonderful news. By the way, too, just as an aside, in the middle of Isaiah right now, the nation of Israel is doing very poorly. And you know what? They brought it on themselves because they've basically walked away from God. And God's way of waking them up about the fact that they walked away from Mr. Mighty Might is by God retracting his mighty might for a season and saying, well, good luck with all those people that surround you and hate you. And God lets them be taken into captivity. And so in a real sense, the irony is the fact that the nation of Israel looks at God and says, we don't need you anymore. And by the way, we are sort of admiring the surrounding cultures, and we think we want a little bit more of what they're doing. And God says, fine, have at it. And the bad guys come in and take them over and take them away. Now, these periods of taking away are temporary, but the temporary roaming in the wilderness, basically, of Assyria or Babylon, all that kind of captivity stuff, it's really an intention on God's part, how do you put this, to therapeutically bring your heart back to him. Now, when there's times in which you are rebellious to God, maybe you don't think of it as being rebellion, but many times what happens is you start to say, well, God's very important in my life, and this thing's way down here, and then suddenly you let the thing that really isn't that important become very important, and you let the importance of God go down. God many times at that point lets you be taken into captivity by that thing, so that you can find out that once you set your hopes and dreams and source of life from that thing, that it will betray you. You go, well, what was I thinking? And it comes back. So part of God's strategy with you is to let you have what you want. And that's really scary. Unless what you want is God himself, and he'll let you have him too. So just saying, we shoot ourselves in the foot, and this God is the one who's mighty, and he can keep you from that stuff, but often he lets those things happen so you'll come back and recognize who he is. Okay, wonderful counselor, mighty God. Do you know what the next one is? Okay. That one's coming. See, I knew you guys knew this. It's just the order. Okay, that too is an interesting, That's an interesting, unexpected thing to put for a king, really.
But some faiths just ignore that. Just leave it out.
Some faiths just ignore that. Who would leave that out? Yeah, sometimes it's just excised altogether because it doesn't make any sense, you know. Everlasting Father. Okay, so you need to soften this a little bit and realize that we're talking kind of in a general sense of everlasting Father. A father in an ancient culture is the one who's responsible for a family and provides for it and protects for it. There's the general sense of care. When you see father, you think care. That's what's going on here. It can also literally mean father, but I mean, we need to start from the general spot. But what's interesting about this is this word in front of it. I mean, okay, so this person who has all rule and dominion is a father and is a caring kind of paternal figure over all mankind. We get that. But everlasting, I mean, like forever? You mean there's this person who has all rule and dominion is someone as a father who cares for all of mankind from the beginning and end of time and to the entire domain edges of the universe? Everlasting? Yes. So again, we're seeing that this is not just a physical person. This is someone whose characteristics of care, paternally speaking, for mankind, has started before the universe started and will end, and will never come to an end. I mean, it's extending forever on both ends. Everlasting. An everlasting Father. So really, I'll just leave this as never-ending Father. There's no surprises in those words right there. That's exactly what they mean. It's pretty darn literal. It's there. The word Father is ab, A-B, not these abs, but the ab is an Abraham, ab. So it just means father. So really, that's what it means. Well, we're just going to leave that for a second and go on to Prince of Peace. Okay, now that one I would expect. I mean, that makes sense. I would have put that at the top of the list. Because if you're going to have some ruler come in and be the ruler over everything, really, from my own perspective, I want that person to be there to ensure peace for me. You know, I just want to be left alone and be at peace and do my thing and not have all the bad guys on the other side of the river coming over and attacking us all the time and making our life horrible. And I just want to be left at peace, right? That's what I want from a ruler, a domain ruler. That's what I want, someone to just give me peace. That's the idea in the modern 21st century about peace. But that's not what this word peace means. This also is an unexpected kind of twist. You know what this word is in Hebrew. Shalom. Shalom. There it is. But shalom doesn't mean an absence of conflict. It really means wholeness. Did you know that? So, and in fact, this is interesting. A little technical tidbit. You know that the Old Testament was translated into Greek for common use a couple centuries before Jesus. So there was a Greek version of the Hebrew Old Testament around at the time of the apostles and Jesus. So when the guys who translated this word shalom into Greek, the word they used in Greek often was this word that we use all the time, teleos, which means complete. In Matthew 5, you know, be perfect, that means complete, actually, teleos. So that word perfect in Matthew 5, is the interpreters said that's what this means. And really, that ties together. Shalom means to be whole and complete and missing nothing. And because of that, your heart's at rest. And the result is what we know as modern day 21st century peace. It's like, but it really is the idea of completeness. It's completeness. Are you missing anything? Many times, a friend of mine, he'd ask me when I looked kind of perturbed, he'd say, "Brother, have you lost your peace?" And I could tell I was sort of telegraphing something on my face because I was probably doing this. And he said, "You lost your peace?" "Well, yeah." "Why?" And I'd explain one thing that's falling short, that I'm not complete in anymore. And that thing falls short and it attracts my attention and all that kind of stuff. So really what I had to do was say, okay, that thing is something, but I need to put it in the right category. It's really not life-threatening because in the Lord, what he's done on our behalf through Christ, I am now complete, and I'm whole, and I'm lacking nothing in Christ. All those other little things, they will wreck your peace if you think they're necessary for completeness. But in the end, at the end of our lives, I think God's going to bring us all to a position where all the things that we think we're falling short of, that we need, that we don't really need, that are not Him, we'll let go of. And He'll say, am I enough? Am I sufficient? Am I what you need for completeness? And we'll say, yeah. Yeah, all the other stuff was just distractions. So this Prince of Peace, now we have peace, which means completeness and wholeness. It's the best all-purpose word for you for happiness and blessedness and contentment. I mean, everything that makes life wonderful. That's the best word you can use in the Old Testament for that. But now this guy isn't just the giver of peace. He's the Prince of Peace. What does that imply? And again, this word prince just means like captain, or it means someone who's in charge at a certain middle level in a sense. Why is that so nice that we call him not just the giver, the donor of peace, or the path to peace, or whatever, but he's actually the captain. He's the Prince of Peace. Why is that so important? Well, because it implies that he holds at bay the things that will cause you to lose your wholeness. He's powerful enough, like a defender against a city that's being attacked, to be able to hold off those things from the sources that want to destroy, to steal, kill, and destroy, as Jesus says about the bad shepherd, to steal, kill, and destroy. All those things that threaten, in a real sense, he's able, as a defensive captain, to push off and say, nope, not coming in here, because I'm the Prince of their peace. Now that's mighty good news. It doesn't apply as quickly to us because we're not in the ancient culture they were. But again, in the ancient culture they would build big walls around their cities as their source of peace so that people couldn't get in. You know, the Wall of China, so people couldn't get in. So really, that was their source of peace, was the defensive structure they put around that. So they understood when you said Prince of Peace, you'd say, yeah, this guy is tasked militarily and through his power to prevent my wholeness from being taken away. Wow. Wow. Shall guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. We just looked at that in Philippians. It's the same idea. It's exactly the same idea. Prince of Peace. So I just kind of summarize this line right here. The Captain Wholeness. He's Captain Wholeness. He is Captain Wholeness. That's almost a perfect translation of Prince of Peace. He is Captain Wholeness. And he exists being all-powerful of the entire universe through his might and power to be the captain of your peace, your wholeness, your completeness. What it takes to complete the design that God had originally in Adam for all of us, which got trashed at the fall, and now we're falling far short of that. He says, I'm going to bring you back to the original idea of what mankind is. In Eden, my original idea, where I am the fullness and the protector of their wholeness. Christianity at its core, and don't forget this, Christianity at its core is about restoring wholeness to people. But that wholeness is realized in the nearness of God himself. So people who normally look at Christianity and they're skeptics and they point out the bad stuff, say, well, those Christians, they're just all about making a list and telling people what they cannot do, and they're just spoil sports and raining on my parade. If I want to do this and that makes me happy, then who are they to say that I can't do that? Those restrictive, narrow-minded Christians. And so they paint a picture. You probably heard that, Barry. I have. And they paint a picture of the fact that Christianity is all about minimizing my life's chances at wholeness, not maximizing it. And we need to be constantly saying, no, I want you to get this because I want you to find wholeness like you've never found it before. But the key is that wholeness is found in your Creator. That's what's different. Now, when you start conversations about Christianity that way with people, it's usually very intriguing, really. What do you mean it's all about my wholeness? It's all about my restricted wholeness. It's all about what I can't do. No, and it can lead you into some great conversations. But always start there, because that's the promise. And I think when Jesus walked in his 3 years of ministry physically, people didn't follow him because they liked the restrictions he was putting in their lives, right? He was bringing them wholeness. I think one of the most vivid examples, well, there's lots of them in the New Testament, but Zacchaeus, who goes up in the tree, the little man who climbs up in the tree, you got those Sunday school songs going in your head? Zacchaeus is a man who had kind of painted himself into a very restricted, narrow life. He had made everyone around him mad. He was taking advantage of all the people around him. He was a man who lived a very small life as a tax collector. He was not living a whole life. But he thought he was. He thought if I take all this money and I make myself richer than everybody else, the money itself, even though it's going to cost me all my friends and all my family, that will make me happy. But in the end, it didn't make him happy. It was a false god in that particular sense. And so when Jesus sees him up in the tree, desperately trying to just get a glimpse of Jesus, when Jesus sees him in the tree, he looks at him and with this idea in mind, looks at him and says, this is a man who needs wholeness. But in his stupidity, he's painted himself into a situation in life where he has no wholeness anymore. This man needs wholeness. Now that's also a really good tip, and I don't want to belabor this, but that's also a really good tip when you have enemies. Jesus said, love your enemies. Ha, fat chance. Do you know what they did to me? You know what they said about me? You know, I didn't deserve it. It's unjust. We need justice. Gosh, I'm the only person who's ever had that experience. What you need to do is look at them and say, here's a person who's no longer whole. They're not whole. This person needs wholeness in their life. This person needs Jesus. That's how you can love them. Because people in that position take it out on you, whether you like it or not, trying to make their lives more whole. And in the end, they're digging themselves into a smaller and smaller space. And what you need to do is look at them in compassion and say, there's no wholeness in this person's life. And it's evident in how they're treating me. Can I tell you about Jesus? He alone brings wholeness that you're always meant to have. So just keep that in mind. The Prince of Peace, he's Captain Wholeness. And then he goes on in verse 7 and says some marvelous things. Oh, let me just, I put the circle under to remind myself because I'd already forgotten. As I was researching shalom and peace, and there's a favorite book that I use, and the commentators, really smart guys in Hebrew, they wrote something I just wanted you to see as well. This is from the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament. It says, in nearly 2/3 of its occurrences, shalom describes the state of fulfillment, which is the result of God's presence. Yes. I couldn't say it that well. Shalom is the fullness that comes by the nearness of God. Because he satisfies all your desires, like nothing else ever will. That's what it's. Great quote. Okay, now I'll push on. Verse 7. Of the increase of his government and of peace, there will be no end. Woohoo! So it's not just a temporary, status, and then suddenly the calendar's going to flip to another year and everything ends and he's no longer in charge. In fact, instead of saying it'll just go on forever, he says it'll get better and better and better and better and better. It'll get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. It's an advancing kingdom. It's not a stable kingdom in that sense. So this promise and your participation that this government, and there's that word, that's the second time and only other time in the Bible it's used, there will be no end. No end. No end. It's not a temporary deal. It's forever. No end to that. Oh, man. And on the throne of David and over his kingdom to establish it and to uphold it. Okay, now wait a second. Wait. I thought you said this person was ruler and dominion over everything, not just Israel. So why are we talking about King David? Well, because King David has implications beyond just the nation of Israel. King David was a prototype for this person. King David sat in there, and like I told you, he was a flawed man, which gives us all tremendous hope. He did a horrible thing. I mean, he slept with the wife of one of his mighty men, and then he engineered to get this guy killed so that David wouldn't be implicated. I mean, it's the nastiest, seamiest story in the entire Old Testament, really. Well, there's a couple others that are pretty bad. When I think about it. But that is such a mean, ugly thing that he did. And yet, there's this part of David, there's a man after God's own heart. And in a real sense, God used him as a template to say, when this one comes from Isaiah 9, 6, and 7, there's certain aspects of him that have been prototyped in David, so you'll get it. You'll get it. You'll get what he's like. You'll get what he's like. and because of who David is. So really the throne of David, when he mentions that right here, the throne of David is that idea of the ideal prince, captain, king, ruler, dominion, all that kind of stuff wrapped into one man. So that's David, or the throne of David, and over his kingdom to establish and to uphold it. So to establish and to uphold means it's the first end of the eternal stuff. I mean, to establish it, to say this is permanent, it's got a foundation, it won't be changed, and has the power to keep it there forever. So yeah, you going to say true? He's a shepherd, totally a shepherd. All the different metaphors we get in terms of care and rules, shepherds, kings, all those things are really all wrapped up into trying to point to this one who's the wonderful counselor and the mighty God, the everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. They're all pointing to this one ultimate one, this one. And so that's what he's talking about. To establish it means to really get it set. It's not going to slip away in the next earthquake. And to uphold it, nothing will change that establishment. So again, it's away from the beginning side of eternity to say that this has been established and it'll never be shaken. He can do that. The throne of David. And yay, finally, with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forever. So now we have a ruler, unlike our flawed politicians who believe in justice and righteousness, and exhibit it not only in a personal life of the ruler, but also as the main trait that he brings to those who are wayward and whom he loves, justice and righteousness. Now, as a group of people who sense injustice and have injustice visit them frequently, you always pine away for a ruler who will understand your circumstance, who will see the injustice, and who will take action on your behalf, right? That's what you really hope for. If you've been through our justice system for any reason at all, and we won't ask for a raise of hands of who's been in jail, but if you've had any connection with the justice system, you realize that this idea of righteousness, justice, it's the ideal, but it never quite gets there because the justice system is occupied by flawed people, unfortunately. It's a little frustrating. And if you've been to court and you've come out again and you're dissatisfied with the result, often what you think is, well, this is unjust because this is what I know about my situation. This is what they should understand about my situation. But the courts never understood me. And I get that. We're going to have always kind of a moderated success in a human sense when it comes to justice, but not with this person. This person right here comes with justice and righteousness forever. There are no missteps with this one. And this is why in the scriptures, when you're wronged, you're constantly being asked, oh, listen, you know what? You could go out in vengeance and get that person who wronged you, and it would seem just. But you know what? God says, justice is mine. Vengeance is mine. Which is not a way of saying God's up there itching to get out his revolver and start going at people. It's the fact that the whole job of rectifying injustice comes from this one. And why? Because he'll never misjudge the circumstance. He'll never misjudge the harm that's been taken to you. He'll never underestimate the value of what's been taken from you. He sees it. He sees it, and he's got it, and you can leave it to him. He's in charge of justice. Now, it's another, I don't know how much I want to say about this, but it's another thing you need to talk about with people who don't know the Lord, is to tell them that there is a time coming when this loving God will engage his justice in an irresistible way. And in previous generations, we used to talk about, the threat of hell and stuff like that. That's a real thing. But there is one coming who sees it all and one day will finally balance the books of injustice with unremitting, irresistible justice and might. Now, you don't do that to scare people, but it should scare people because we have such a warped sense of what's right and wrong right now. And even if you did something this last week that you think, well, I really shouldn't have done that. But after all, on the scale of bad things, that's way down there. I shouldn't. I won't do it next time, but it's really small. we have our own kind of warped sense of justice in that particular sense. And if there's something that you have done, your sense, your bar where justice needs to be penalized is much lower than it is for other people, right? So there is a real message all throughout the Old and New Testament that this one will come and judge. And that just has to be a serious part of people's understanding about this God. Now, again, and we don't have time to cover this, the reason why that kind of justice is necessary in the traits of God is because he's a loving God. And you'll say, well, wait a second. If he's a loving God, then why is he bringing down the hammer on all these people? Well, because, my friend, you have brought the hammer down on the people he loves. Wouldn't it not be wrong for him to turn a blind eye toward the injustice you do to others if he loves the one who were afflicted by your injustice? I mean, this is very clear in my family. If my son came home from school one day in elementary school with a black eye, and he said, listen, this bully in the yard came and whacked me and gave me this black eye, and he's crying, his clothes are all mussed up and stuff like that. Well, I want justice. And I want it all the more because this happened to someone I love so much. Love in its core is separating the good from the bad for those you love. And when you bring out the good, you give it to those you love. And you separate out the bad. So that whole process of separating the good and the bad, that's called justice. So really, we could talk a long time about this. A loving God has to also be a just God. And when we realize that all of us have brought injustice on the people that God loves, you're a target for God's justice. Now that's sobering. That just should be sobering. This is the God we have. His justice and righteousness from this time forth and forever. Now watch this. This is the one that tells you we're not talking about a man alone. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. Now this is pretty cool because when kings came into power in the ancient days, they would come into power one of two ways. They would either be born into it or they'd have a coup. Right? So if someone became a king, the next king, the zeal that made that happen was one of those two things. And even if you were born into it, many times it was one of your parents or someone in the family who said, okay, we have lots of kids, but this one's going to be king. If you look at the history of the Caesars around the time of Jesus, oh my gosh, it was crazy. They were poisoning each other in Caesar's household so that certain sons or some would be positioned in a way that the moms would get their son to become king. That's how Tiberius became king, by the way, during the time of Jesus, because the right person was poisoned at the right time. And he was related, but there you go. After Tiberius came Claudius, and after Claudius came Nero. Claudius was kind of, he was handicapped, I guess he was. Clubfoot, I think that's what it was. But Claudius got talked into adopting his own nephew. What? Yeah, adopting his own nephew. Because his mom wanted her son to be the next Caesar. And so the mom of Nero kind of positioned him in the place. And so there's a lot of things you can do to be in line to be family-wise. But you know what? If you're just a powerful person, you can just have a coup and have all the military guys do it for you. But in this case, it's totally different. Who engineers this ruler? The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. This is God's plan. This is what I love the word zeal, because zeal really means to be enthusiastic and encouraged and irresistible and here we go, woo! You can't stop someone who has zeal. This is saying that this is God's idea for this particular person, for these traits that we're talking about, and it's because God is enthusiastic about it and no one's going to resist him. Yeah.
What's the word for Lord of hosts?
Lord of hosts literally means Lord of hosts. Oh, I think it's L again, but I'll have to take a look. Yeah, I think it is. Someone look that up for me, because I didn't look that one up. Pretty sure. Is it Yahweh? Yahweh Tserot? It could very well be. Yeah. Not sure. But when he adds the of host part, that's always a clue to the fact that this guy is in charge of mighty armies that you can't even see. So it always implies huge power and might at his disposal. So it's a way of saying this is God's enthusiastic idea No one's going to resist him because, in fact, he's in charge of all the invisible power of heaven. This is what he's going to do. You'll have to look that one up. I can't remember right now. Yeah. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. So this is a way, we're right in this little tiny 2 verses in the middle of Isaiah when Israel's being bad and God's trying to figure out how to get their attention back and all that kind of stuff. And here's this little shining beam of light coming out of Isaiah 9 saying, there is one on whose shoulder all rule and dominion has been placed. And this is the enthusiastic design of God that cannot be resisted. Did you find it?
It's Yahweh.
Oh, is it? So it's Yahweh? Okay, it's Yahweh. Yeah.
I was wondering, how could Paul have missed this?
I know. I know. Yeah, Paul as a Pharisee have missed this. Well, that's actually a good segue, because when you look at the Messiah, the topic of Messiah in the Old Testament, and this is a classic. I mean, if you made a list of 5 sections in the Old Testament talked about the Messiah, this is almost number 1 every time. I mean, you see it. There's a couple of Psalms that are really good too. But this one's huge. So the idea of who this one who is going to come, the Messiah from a Jewish mindset, was someone for whom they had huge expectations. Huge. And whose justice would never be thwarted. So that's why to this very day, if you ask a Jew and say, well, don't you realize that Jesus is the Messiah? They'll say, he didn't do any of this stuff. He got killed. What are you talking about? That's crazy talk. And that's actually that's a rational deduction. Really, it's a rational deduction. The only part of this that he really let me go back. The only part of this that he really very clearly did is the wonderful counselor part, and they'll give him that. They'll say, he spoke really great words. He seemed to be compassionate towards people. But mighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, I don't think so. He got killed. So what kind of power does he really wield? So that's not the Messiah. That's not the Messiah. So, but of course what we do is when we look at this, we realize that this indeed is Jesus. But Jesus is coming twice. And even in Jesus' own discourses in the Gospels, he says, I came this time to save. Make no mistake. But the next time I'm coming to judge. And now, interestingly enough, too, from heaven's perspective, it isn't a first stop and a second stop on the timeline of history. Since God's in a timeless domain, he looks at the timeline of history and he sees it all simultaneously. So this son who came is there both times, even though for us we haven't experienced it yet. This is who he is twice. This is a confusion for a lot of the prophets in the Old Testament. There seemed to be a very consistent line of a kingly Messiah, and you'd read this, and then a suffering Messiah. Well, how can that be? If he's kingly, he's all-powerful, he shouldn't suffer. He should be the one who makes other people suffer. So for the Jews and the rabbis who would read the Old Testament, they go, well, I don't know. Let's just forget that suffering part, and let's just talk about the kingly part. Yeah. Was Jesus the kingly one? No. But he was the suffering one. So if they're rational, they'll realize that these 2 mentions, these 2 streams of thought in the Old Testament of a suffering and a kingly Messiah, maybe indeed the fact that Jesus so completely fulfilled by prophecies, the suffering Messiah, might actually mean he's the same guy who's the kingly Messiah. So maybe he comes a second time. That's it. So he's a king. But then it dawned on me that we completely overlooked probably the most unexpected part of these verses. It's these. For to us a child is born, and us a son is given. Now, when you think about the ascension of kings in the ancient world, this is a stupid idea. I mean, not stupid. It's uncharacteristic. Let me just read for you what happens when a king comes to ascension. Here's David dying and Solomon coming to the throne. 1 Kings 2. Then David slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. And the time that David reigned over Israel was 40 years. He reigned 7 years in Hebron, 33 years in Jerusalem. So Solomon sat on the throne of David, his father, and his kingdom was firmly established. Well, that's how a king comes into power. Not like this. This is weird. Okay? I mean, just think with me for a minute. This is weird. You either have a coup or you have a son who becomes king after the father dies. You don't have a king come in to rule like this. This is crazy. And that's one of the things that God kind of slapped me and says, you read right past that and think that's normal. Well, yeah, because Jesus was born as a baby, yeah. But it's really abnormal from the idea of what king ascension is. It's very unusual. Let me just, what I'd like to challenge you to do is think about this as the next weeks go on, because this is really astonishing. Let me just point out a few things right here. The fact that he's a son means he's got a father. Oh yeah. The fact that he's a son means he's... Well, now, wait a second. Solomon was a son, and David was his father. So that's not unusual. Yeah, but hold on to a second. Solomon became king after the father died. This phrasing tends to give you the idea that the father never died for him to become the king. Why? Well, because he says right here that the son is given. Not that the son took over after dad died. So the imagery is that the father took his son while he was still father and in charge and gave his son for a particular purpose. This is not standard king ascension talk. This is weird, is what this is. So it tends to imply that the father is still alive and appointing the son this ultimate rule and authority over everything. That's what the language says. It's right there. We just read over it every Christmas. Oh, wait a second. A son is given. And also, it sounds like it's the continuation of the father's rule, like the never-ending father idea. Because the father really is in charge because he's the paternal protector and provider for all the universe. That's just the clearly unspoken truth. But then he's saying, basically, I'm going to give my son to continue doing it in this sense. So in a way, not only is the father not dead, but in a way, the son is promoting the same goals with the same power as the father. It's all implied in this language right here. And when we look at this, when we look at the relationship between Jesus and the Father, that's exactly true. Now, in ancient days, oldest sons, we talked about this a while ago, oldest sons had a peculiar distinction in the line of the family and the children and stuff like that. The oldest son was always presumed to be the one who was going to take over dad's business. He was the one that continued dad's business. So much so that when dad was getting older, kind of in his retirement years like that, and dad still had to go out, and he had to not only make contracts for how he's going to sell his grain that he's growing, all that kind of stuff, but you need to figure out how the contracts are going to go, who you're going to hire to help you, all this kind of stuff. Dad's got all these jobs to make his fields work and stuff like that. So when dad gets old, who does he go to do his business for him? The oldest son, because he's going to take over the business in a very short amount of time when dad dies. So when the son would go out and do contracts for selling grain or hiring people, all that kind of stuff, when the son would go out, now listen, the son would have the exact authority and power to speak on behalf of the father. He had exactly the same goals. He had exactly the same purposes. He indeed, when he spoke, his father spoke. He didn't do anything that the father didn't tell him to do. He didn't say anything that the father didn't allow him to say. And that's what Jesus said in the Gospels. So the relationship between the son and the father, they're distinct in some way, but they're exactly the same in another. And this is the mystery of the Trinity in that real sense. And here you see it hinted at just in the way that phrase is put together.
It ties in when he says all authority is given.
All authority is given, yeah. So there you have this one who is in charge of the entirety of everything. All authority is given to me, Matthew 28, last verse. This is, but in normal kingship, the dad who's the king before has to die. In this phrasing, the dad does not die. The dad appoints to continue what he's doing in the universe. That's wacky from an ancient idea. But it's not wacky when we think about Jesus. Then you look more over here. It looks as though he was given for our benefit. Now listen, normal kings, if they were going to do this crazy thing, they would do it for their own benefit, to make sure that their riches and everything that they'd worked to keep all these times, even with the firstborn and stuff like that, I want to make sure that everything I worked for my entire life isn't blown up by my stupid family, or they take it apart because, when I die, they just want to take all the assets. Instead, that's what we normally would think. But here, he's giving this one to rule for our benefit, to us. He's a gift to us. What? Not in order to preserve the Father, but to preserve us. See, that's astonishing. I've never seen this in these verses before. But they're just little words to us. a son is given. And then in the front of that, it's when he's born. And do you realize that when a child is born, he has absolutely no human credentials at all? Nothing. Nothing. There's no credentials that a baby has that you could give him a name and say, well, he's the mighty Father, the eternal Father, Prince of Peace. He's the mighty God. He doesn't have those credentials to us in a human sense. But here he's saying he'll have these credentials before he's even humanly born. Yeah.
The name Emmanuel,
Emmanuel, God with us. So this is unusual and unexpected, that the one who's appointed is also, since we know he's God, because we just said that in the previous verse, we also know that he's going to be born. So he's going to be human, but he's going to have the credentials before he's humanly born to be the one who's this king. Now that sounds like Jesus a whole lot, right? And then look right in front of it. Again, from the very beginning, from the beginning of this one, it seems as though his purpose in terms of being appointed by the Father is our benefit, because he's been given to us. Now you read that and you think, oh my gosh, there is some uber ruler, dominion, guy in charge who's been given for the purposes to us to bring us wholeness. And this has been God's idea from the very beginning. And that's what's, I feel kind of sheepish about the fact that I've never seen that in those verses. It's so unlike any other ascension of any other king in any other human context that this sentence right here is so totally expected. It made me stand up from my chair and take a few steps back in the room and go, wait a second, that's bizarre. And yet, when we come to Christmas, since we know the Christmas story so well, yes, indeed, there's one who's a baby that's born. But have you ever seen any other king in the entire realm of history that has taken this step into his ascension into rule? No. Because listen, here's the other thing. If someone's born who's going to become king, that person is suddenly a target for all the people who prefer to become king. So it's coming in from a very weak perspective, unless the existing king protects them. So there's a lot of human dynamics here that hint about the fact that this one will come weak and helpless, and yet is already the ruler of the universe. And Herod tried to kill him. That was a very bad idea. It's a very bad idea. So anyway, think on that as the next weeks go across, because that's just an astonishing phrase. Again, earlier in Isaiah, he uses the same imagery. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and he'll call his name Emmanuel, just like you're saying. God with us. So there's one who's a physical human being, but he is indeed God with us, which you can only rectify when you read Isaiah 9, 2 chapters later. That makes a lot of sense, actually, because his rule is going to be far beyond a human, but he's going to be a human. How can someone in this position be both human and God simultaneously? And yet this tells us that's exactly who this one's going to be. Now, there's dispute about whether this Isaiah passage is really misused about Jesus. Maybe it's just about the rulers that come in Isaiah. But then the writer, Matthew, writes in Matthew 1, behold, he quotes it, the virgin shall conceive, bear a son, and they'll call his name Emmanuel. And in case your Greek or your Hebrew's bad, that means God with us, is what he actually writes in the text, which means God with us, just in case you missed it. Okay. So the whole idea of that. And then again, in Luke 2, when the announcement of the coming, the angels are over them, and the angel says to them, fear not, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy. This is the Linus passage from good news of great joy that'll be for all the people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior who is the Messiah, the Lord. Now, all of you could take that line apart for days, but it's saying basically this is the one who's purposed for your wholeness, who's been promised. He's the Messiah. And he's got power. He's the Lord. And he's been born right now. And oh, by the way, this will be a sign for you. You'll find a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger. You'll find a baby. Isn't that weird? You'll find a helpless baby who has absolutely no credentials, who has absolutely no wealth, so little wealth, in fact, that he has to be sleeping in a place where animals feed. He comes as nothing. And yet, this is the one who is the Messiah. This is the one who's coming from David's town, which is, is a nice sign about the fact that it's coming from the throne of David. This is the one who fulfills all that stuff. This is the one who is the fulfillment of Isaiah 9, 6, and 7. And they're saying it in that little line right there in 11 and 12. In other language, you're quoting Isaiah 9, 6, and 7. He'll be a baby. We're going to sing Adore as we kind of check out right now. You stepped down from heaven, humbly you came, God of all creation here with us. And in a starlit manger, Emmanuel, God with us, light of the world, here to save us from our sins and bring the completeness and wholeness of peace by his sacrifice. Don't let this not stun you at Christmas, because this is stunning what Jesus did. That's why you can go back to the whole topic of Christmas every single year, and it'll take your breath away when you realize what God has done in the timeline of all history. So I want you guys to come up, and we'll sing this, and then we'll quit this morning. Such incredible scriptures. Father in heaven, we thank you for preserving these words for us. They are just staggering. They're staggering in their dimension. They're staggering in their timing. They're staggering in their purposefulness that you have intended for our benefit. And Lord, we forgive us when we so easily look at Christmas and look at the coming of this Messiah and say, well, I know the story and it's kind of routine now. And yes, I'm very thankful. But Lord, we seldom slow down enough right now to let it just stun us again. And Lord, we're stunned. That from the beginning of the universe, this was your plan. To have one come who is fully man, fully God, who is tasked with our wholeness, our shalom, who is the captain of that shalom, in fact, on our behalf. And Lord, you have brought us to yourself, and in you we have come to find wholeness. Like the psalmist says, the nearness of God is my good. And the bread of life feeds me bread that nothing else has. You are all we need. And we are delighted about the fact that you came close to us and you brought us to yourself. There's nothing we did on our behalf to entice you or to make ourselves worthy. But you came to us even while we were yet sinning, and you died on our behalf. And the words of Jesus to his apostles when he said, it's for this reason that I was born. That continues to stun us. Thank you for your great and demonstrated love for us. And we pray that through this season, your Spirit would continue to remind our distracted hearts about the incredible news of your coming. So thanks now for it's time to look at this in Jesus' name. Amen.